Often said, after hearing a lot of brothers talk and movements clash or individuals rant and rave, is that no matter how much we protest, no matter how much we demonstrate, or how much we display what we think we are, we have, for the most part, underestimated our situation in the United States. I recall back in 1962 and 3, when I was in Harlem, there was a young brother there who worked in close collaboration with me on a number of movements in that community. But this young man, 21-year-old, was one of my colleagues. And when things got very hot in Harlem in the fight among different black factions, he decided to bow out. And he said to me one day that he's going underground because he said, it's not that I'm afraid, that isn't it. He says, what I really fear above all is that so many of our people don't know what they're doing. He says, but that isn't so bad that they don't know what they're doing. He said, what is really scary is that they don't know they don't know.
Most black people don't know what they're doing. But the greater issue is that they don't know that they don't know. Let's discuss.
Get ready for power. Prince's Power Hour podcast. One, two.
Welcome back to another installment of Prince's Power Hour podcast, where we want to have edifying, intelligent, thought-provoking conversations with the intention of hopefully strategizing, at least surfacely, right? Because you can only do so much on the internet, but strategizing in a way that we can alleviate and hopefully remove our current negative, dejected condition. First and foremost, giving all honor and praise to the creator of the heavens and the earth. We thank our ancestors. We thank all of those who have given their lives so that we could be in this position to even have the knowledge, the wherewithal, the desire to be free and to see a more just, equitable world, especially for the generations to come. I want to first take a moment to thank my brother, Moray Kananya, who, what was it, a couple weeks ago, we had the privilege of having a wonderful conversation. We did part one, still have part two to finish, and when his schedule permits, we're definitely going to finish that. I've been a little busy dealing with a couple of things. That's why we missed last week, but life is a beautiful thing because it gives you, those peaks and valleys where you gotta kind of circumnavigate, with all of the responsibilities and the realities of the world, but you still have to make time for what is important. So today, we're gonna have a conversation. Usually I have a particular subject matter that we broach. I like to call them video essays to a degree, but we're having a conversation. More importantly, we're having a conversation and we're having a dialogue, even though it seems one-sided, right? But I'm paying attention, to the comments. So, when you comment, I definitely want to have you engage and then we converse on particular points. But what I mean that it's a dialogue is because I'm responding and I'm speaking to a particular subjects that we may or may not be conscious of, but that we're dealing with in real time. And so I played a writer, activist, a social commentator, Howard Cruz, who wrote the famous literary work, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And it's a book that for some reason I've been called to read again. Well, I've read bits and pieces of, but now I'm going back to it, and I'm kind of taking my time with it, really, as I like to do when I'm reading a particular piece, a historical piece that has such relevance to today. I try to go through the minutia, right? I try to not just put myself in that time, but try to investigate to the best of my ability the surrounding narratives that affect the particular subject matter that the author is broaching. And in my desired attempt to do so, hopefully come out with a knowledge that is applicable today, so that I could discuss it not just with those who are personally around me, but those who I have the ability to talk to through the internet, so that we can have certain conversations that I can bring to light certain particular points and perspectives that give us the ability to transcend our current condition. History is best qualified to reward one's research. I always say that because it's so important to understand what is happening now. You have to go back. It's almost impossible, right, to really look at the current landscape and to take the news for face value, even if you're doing a deep dive and you're trying to separate the fallacies from the truth, the more accurate accounts of what is happening right now. It's so many things, especially when you talk about what's going on the global scene, geopolitics, behind the proverbial curtain, that the most intelligent of us know that the parts that are missing are some of the most important parts, right? The minutia, the details, the back end deals that are not shown to the populace, not shown to the public, are not being made available to you and I unless we are intimately involved. And if we're intimately involved, in most cases, we're compromised to a degree that we may not have the layman proletarian's best interests in heart and in mind. So we have to go to history, because history gives light in another degree because of the research, what's being unearthed, those secrets that weren't able to be held in by those who participated at the time, who may be laden with the stress and the burden of seeing such atrocities, such travesties happen in their time, and they want to give it to someone, even if it's to their own people, for the benefit and to edify them for the future, right? We glean unto the past so that we are equipped enough, right, with the historical account of what has transpired to be able to intelligently dissect what we are dealing with today. I know I said a lot, right? And it may sound like a word salad, but I want you to really understand what I'm saying. History is best qualified to reward its research because what we are dealing with today is a product of past decisions that were made. So we go back in history to interpret and understand today to better deal with the moment so that we position ourselves in a advantageous way for the future. History is best qualified to reward its research. Howard Cruz, in the clip that I played opening up the show, spoke to someone that he was working with in the 70s and the late 60s. And the gentleman said that the issue with our people, the different fractions that were kind of have had a combative nature or were in conflict in Harlem at the time, New York, even though they should have been seeing how they could work together, right, to collaborate to take on the greater enemy, a lot of times because of our ideological differences and our religious persuasions, and our school of thought, our frame, our orientation, it causes conflict unnecessarily where we're unable to progress collectively. Because whether we understand it or not, whether we're Muslim, Christian, Hebrew, Jew, agnostic, atheist, socialist, capitalist, the list goes on and on. Educator, artisan, a merchant, if you're black, if you're in the black race, right? If you in particular dwell within the confines of North America, you, irrespective to social status, to financial position, you are dealing with the same issues, just at different levels. And those distinctions that we overemphasize has penalized and crushed us to the point that we're never able to mount any form of true resistance, because the resistance that we should have towards our enemy is with one another. He said the issue is not that we don't know, which we don't know what we're doing, he said, is that we don't know that we don't know, right? We act as if we do. Why is that important? I can't remember his name, and I shouldn't be quoting someone. I can't give you exact information, but bear with me when I quote this, because you're going to understand the validity in the statement that I'm about to make. He said, the American Negro is primed for acculturation, meaning when you have a culture, a dominant culture that heavily influences another to absorb them into their cultural practices and norm, right? That's really the process of acculturation relative to the black man and woman. That those former more ways and four ways that we were accustomed to practicing, that had its benefit, that had its relevance, that had its ecological, psychological, sociological, and material benefit, decimated. And we've been amalgamated to another culture, to another practice, to another way of thinking, to another way of interacting, to another way of seeing ourselves and seeing each other that is harmful and destructive to our very existence. Acculturation relative to the Negro in America, the so-called Negro in America is what I'm speaking to. The saying is that the American Negro is primed for acculturation because due to his dehumanization, he is looking for an identity, even if the identity is to his detriment. I repeat, the American Negro is primed for acculturation because due to his dehumanization, he is looking for an identity, even if it's to his detriment. If you take even the short period of time, right? Over 150 years. But if you look at it from the vantage point of the 400 plus years of our captivity in North America, our displacement, our dispossession from land, language, and culture, we coming out of the antebellum South, chattel slavery, were searching for, to a degree, right? It has gotten worse over time because of the continuous bombardment and attack of the open enemy that we are really up against each and every day. We were searching for something to identify ourselves with. We were searching for a home psychologically, sociologically, and even physically to a degree. We were And I want to speak in exact language. Why is my camera not losing? Keep losing focus. It's throwing me off a little bit. That's better. I want to speak in exact terms, but everything is nuanced to a degree, right? But for the most of us that came off those slave fields, we entered into a realm of cultural ambiguity. We were in a sense of purgatory because we got a certain sense of knowledge of self that we got through the stories that were passed on, through the narratives, through the folklore that we tried to hold on to. And obviously things have changed throughout time, but for the most of us, we still had somewhat of an intact remembrance of who we once were before we enacted, or before this act was forced upon us, of slavery and dehumanization, the mental, spiritual, and cultural castration that we were victimized survived for 400 plus years, right? But in that, we were entering a society that those things were not just only frowned upon, they were punishable by death, right? When you look back and you look at the slave codes and what came out of that, right? Any time that black people would show any semblance of a culture that is formed in the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture that was dominant in the 1800s, it was vilified, it was demonized, and it was punishable by death. And so, even though we were seemingly to be left alone to develop ourselves away from the slave master, that was never the reality. Because in a short period of time, we had developed a sense of unity and community based on the aspirations of, once we finally get from up under the slave master's foot, that we will be able to enact these things and live them in prosperity. And to a degree and to a certain extent, we did those things, right? We built prosperous economic communities. We developed skill sets, and we utilized the things that we had developed over the worst period of history that a people have ever faced in recorded history, right? We utilized these skill sets to do for self. And in that, again, when we would create these enclaves, these small pockets where we were prospering, the enemy would come and see that as a threat. See, the thing about the concept of white supremacy is that especially at the lower level, the more degenerate white man, who was the overseer, his only claim to fame, because he doesn't get the riches, he doesn't get the social status of the higher echelon white supremacy, his claim to fame, his desire to practice it, his reward, his gift, is that he can lord over and seem to be in a higher state, irrespective to actual talent, gifts, and skill set than the black man. So when he knows he's at the bottom of the bottom, intellectually, his creativity, his physical prowess, his ability to earn and develop and create and be entrepreneurial, to be innovative, he knows, irrespective to all those deficiencies, he's still supreme, at least socially, than the black man and woman. And so that's his claim to fame. So when he would see his reality fleeing, because a lot of their financial resources came from being the overseers over the plantation, when their money was taken away because this form of slavery wasn't completely eradicated, because it was still pockets where it existed, but it was attenuated to a degree. A lot of them lost finances, so they were poor and destitute. So what did they do? They created a dynamic where then they would terrorize these new free blacks, these uppity niggers is what they called them. Because the ability to do for self made you uppity, meaning that you were exceeding your perceived permanent social status of being cattle, of being material to the slave owner. And that wasn't accepted. Why am I bringing this history up? 2, it socialized us in a way, all right? 3, that they socialized in a way. 2, that my brother, shalom, man, we got to do something, brother Tyrone. We got to do something soon. I'm going to be reaching out for you. Assalamu alaikum. But it socialized us in a way. It created a dynamic where a lot of us were ready to fight, but still we weren't militarily ready and prepared, because you got to realize that a lot of our conditioning listen to this. This is important. Let me take this little quick moment to paint this picture. one of the three things that they took from us, that they stripped from us, to the best of their ability, was the science of mating, which is essentially the science of family, the science of military, how to defend ourselves, and how to develop defense systems in every aspect of human activity. So that's physical, that's spiritual, that's cultural, that's social, that's intellectual, and that's economic. And then that leads into the first and foremost, a cultural consciousness and disposition to understand that your identity is sufficient enough. Matter of fact, it's more than sufficient. It's your only saving grace, and you operate consciously, collectively and individually from a cultural orientation that allows you to be prosperous in every endeavor of human activity. Those things were taken from us. So when you say we fought, don't get me wrong now, we fought like hell. I mean, we got Gabriel Prosser, we got Denmark Vesey, we got Nat Turner, we got warriors, and we got others, right? We got real warriors, and there's so many. I'm leaving so many out. But collectively, we didn't have the military mindedness that is needed to protect ourselves. So what do you have? You have, because what they did in breaking the buck is what they called it, and taking the most physically domineering masculine male and reducing him to his lowest possible state, physically, psychologically, and even socially, tying him up on a post with his backside up and anally raping him, and every other torture that they could inflict on a human being. They did it in front of the women and children. So what do? The women psychologically now, in a form to defend themselves and to protect their offspring, they teach their male offspring. I agree, brother. I absolutely agree. So I said, man, we got to connect. We definitely got to connect. My brother. They created the psychology in their offspring to be, one, intellectually weak. When we weren't thinking, they wanted to make them physically strong, but even in the physical component, it was still in a way that they wouldn't be defiant to the slave master. Like, emphasize physical strength, but not the ability to deploy it in an intelligible way. What do we see now? Why am I bringing this up? Because they have long-term effects and ramifications, right? We see the byproduct of, we got some soldiers in the streets right now. All the brothers that we see gang, like, you want to write them off as just thugs, but these are some real soldiers because they got a level of fearlessness that a lot of us do not have. But they don't have the proper intellectual, cultural orientation to direct that warrior-like spirit to those who it should be properly aimed at. Instead, we terrorize one another because, again, and we're going to get into that slightly today. I ain't going to be long with it. It's only an hour, so I'm going to try to fit it all in, but I want to take my time with this conversation. Because ultimately, we're talking about the need for black leadership, right? But so I want to kind of walk us through this. Which, in essence, I'm going to give it away. Black leadership is black masculinity and black manhood, culturally conscious black men who understand their mandate and live by it, will die by it, and do everything in their power to enact the freedom and salvation that we need as a people. Okay, we'll get to that. The women develop men and women who would be dispassionate towards their freedom and only oriented to survive by any means necessary. And I use that term, by any means necessary, because we compromise ourselves in the sense of physical survival, but we're culturally and spiritually dead because we give ourselves up to our enemy in ways we never should. We compromise and we compromise and we compromise and we compromise till we're a shell of ourselves, and the intent to preserve our lives is the actions that actually strip us of our actual life. It's a lot of physically alive but spiritually and consciously dead people, meaning that their physical does not have the ability to produce anything of constructive benefit to the community or even to their own family and themselves. Is that really a people that are alive? I don't think so. That's important. That's important. That's important. So now we see why when you get to the point where we have these enclaves that the socio-cultural condition is not to protect what is ours because we don't really know how to do so. We weren't developed as they were grooming, and because in 1807, 1806, the importation of slaves were banned because the breaking process was too strenuous and too costly for the European. So they had enough black people who were already here on the shores of North America, Central and South America, plus those who were brought in on the slave ships. They had enough black people here that they created breeding farms where they would make mother with son, father with daughter, brother with sister, so forth and so on. Again, creating a mutated version of the black man and woman, one that was malleable and easily suggestible in the programming of what they would do. So they were able to a certain degree be able to predict the behavioral and social outcome of people. But even in that, left unto ourselves, we started to remember a certain cultural orientation that was previously held before our breaking and our enslavement. That is why the onslaught of acculturation was continuous. Whether it was, again, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, whether it was white Jews, right, and any other people who would come in and take advantage. Those two primarily for the number of years. Later on, when you get into the 20th century, 1900s, you would see other groups such as the Irish, Italians, and even the Hispanics start to chip away, right, at the black man's identity and try to integrate them. So, due to this, we were trying to find our footing. I spoke of Gabriel Prosser, brilliant black man in the 1800s who really before the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey coined the term Africa for the Africans. He was what you would consider one of the first Pan-Africans in the sense of ideology, right? Understanding the dynamic of, hey, it's something we got in Africa that we need to connect to, right? Then you had brilliant men like Frederick Douglass, who was considered the greatest orator of his time and probably in the history of black men, right? There's not too many audio speeches, not any audio speeches, I don't think, that you can hear, but his writings alone and his speeches would infer his articulate disposition. Intellectual. They worked together for a time and then they split up based on ideological differences. Frederick Douglass felt that America is the emphasis in which we should put our time, right? And those type of dynamics have been controversial for a while. You've seen the same thing with W.E. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. They both kind of were stationed more on an in-home, in America type of reality, but even their position, how that would go. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get a skill, get a trade. That was Booker T. Washington, the Tuskegee Institute, and these different things. Brilliant man who was very revolutionary and radical, even for those who don't really paint that brush, because a lot of the money that he was able to garner by taking what seemed to be at the time a more passive position was actually very, very radical, because he was developing not just the schools, but he was developing the institutions and the finances that would help back some of the more radical approaches. But W.E. Du Bois was more taking the intelligentsia path, where let's integrate ourselves into their educational systems and let's learn as much as we can. Let's be as literate as possible, right? That's, again, a acculturation process. And I'm one who is a voracious reader, right? I read. I started off this conversation. History is best qualified to reward its research, to know history. I ain't talking about to watch some damn YouTube videos, even though it's something in that. But you gotta research. You gotta do your due diligence. You gotta read. You gotta dissect. You gotta study. You gotta cross-reference. You have to do your research. That's how you understand and unearth any historical accuracy, right? So you got to be a reader to do that. But read with a greater desire than to amalgamate and to associate with the dominant society. Do it in the sense that you're extrapolating a certain knowledge and ability that empowers you for your rise and the separation of you and your enemy. That's what I believe that I'm doing. That's what I was taught to do by my father and by my fathers, my teachers. In particular, my father, Prince Isiel. You had Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who again followed in the line of Gabriel Prosser and those, Bishop McNeil Turner, back to Africa, kind of connecting with that consciousness. He had other political views that somewhat maybe hindered or wasn't as constructive as it could have been for the movement, the most powerful movement at the time for black people, right? But again, those that were inside the Marcus Garvey movement, UNIA, were subjected, because there was not a collective consciousness, to other ideological practices such as socialism, Marxism that was popping up in the early 1900s, right? You got the Eastern European bloc who were now seeking to take advantage of the West for world domination, and knew that the greatest form of disruption for American society was to compromise the Negro. And this is their words. And so there was a heavy emphasis on injecting Marxist views, right? Taking Karl Marx and these guys, Lenin would eventually take over in Russia, and Stalin eventually, and so forth and so on, but interjecting Marxism and communism into the cultural orientation of black people so that they can use that to undermine the current power structure. And because they knew to a degree the decadent state that America had been in due to its treatment of its slaves, sought to take advantage. The only issue is they believed in white supremacy and racism just like their Western European brothers. And even in their attempt to organize these particular unions and groups and these communist and Marxist movements, they still could not remove themselves from dealing with black people who they seen as inferior. And we're talking about a Russian people who found their language was founded by a black man. We're talking about who Pushkin, who am I speaking of? Alexander Pushkin. We're talking about a people who did not have any traction. You're talking about the European, whether it's Eastern or Western. They had no progress without the direct involvement of black people, whether it be the Moors or other North and West Africans who were able to travel into these parts to civilize and give them a level of education and understand that they were unfamiliar with before. The Greek and Roman Empire does not exist without its connection to Africa. Egypt, Ethiopia, so forth and so on. But we don't have, oh man, I appreciate you so much, brother Shalom Blood. He absolutely is, man, and we thank God for his life. Thank God for his life, brother. But back to the point, right? We whether it's communism, whether it's socialism, whether it's different religions that we were gravitating to, right? Again, kind of using the European perspective as our entry point, right? Even for the Hebraic movement, right? A lot of, so there was, for those who know the history, there was a Jewish rabbinical black movement happening, and then there was a children of Israel, like the black people being the true children of Israel, happened simultaneously. Those were two different movements. Those were two different movements, because one was understanding the prophetic nature of a people who fit the scriptural reference of a people being in bondage for 400 years and then being in captivity in a strange land and all of these things that we read about in Deuteronomy, right? So understanding that and seeing themselves in the Bible, seeing themselves in these biblical narratives. And let me say this, the Bible isn't a book, it's more of a library, it's a collection of books, across different genres, so that's another discussion. But seeing themselves in these books, right, and seeing the relevance and the points that are analogous of their experience to what they're reading, and said, hold on, we are special people, we're unique people, and we're going to bring into existence, right, a new world, a new mind, a new heaven, right? We're going to bring into existence something greater than our current condition. So that was the conceptualization of those who identified as the children of Israel from a black African, from a standpoint of understanding that a ethnogenesis has happened. A unique people have been formed in the bowels of North America, and they were being reborn into something other than what their slave masters intended for them to be, but other than what they were before they came into captivity. But then you also had a black Jewish, somewhat acculturation process where now a lot of us were finding ourselves in the line of European jewelry and seemingly emulating a lot of what their practices were. And yes, there are some semblance, but a lot of it was compromised to fit their objectives. So we were learning something that did not benefit. European jewelry does not fit the black man and woman, even if you believe yourself to be the children of Israel. They don't coexist, because one's culture should not be his religion. It should be his nature. It should be who he is, right? And if it does not fit you, then it probably isn't for you. Now that's enough. I hope that was conveyed as clear as could be, because that's a deep subject, and I want to stay within the time frame, so I ain't gonna go too deep into that. But I pray that that's understood. But because there were two competing narratives, the black Jewish identification, and then those who see themselves as the prophetic children of Israel, but were revolutionaries. Those were in conflict. And so you seen the Jewish people who seen an opportunity because now Zionism, when you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, up into the establishment of the present state of Israel, you're talking about the rise of Zionism that needs, as a fuel system and as a form of legitimacy, to be identified with the biblical narratives that justify their presence in the current region, which is known as the state of Israel. So you can have black people who seemingly fit that narrative like a glove, using certain talking points that could possibly delegitimize their political, geopolitical, and global ethno-racial aspirations. And so you use the black Jews to disqualify those who are speaking to such positions. So you got all of this happening at once, right? Acculturation happening. And you see greater forms of disunity happen. I made mention of Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the intellect and scholar W.E. Du Bois, and how a lot of what Marcus Garvey stood for, W.E. Du Bois was against, at least in theory. And there's some nuance to that, right? When you really get into the writings, you start to see the nuance because, with certain positions that he was against more so than the overall narrative of us relocating back to Africa. And Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey didn't believe that everybody should return to Africa. He believed in the qualified few would go back and establish. But so it is nuance. But using that as a premise, they weren't able to, in actual, practical, literal application, work together. And it's such a tragedy because the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey never makes it to Africa. He's exiled Jamaica, then goes to London and becomes a shell of himself, and the UNIA kind of disintegrates right before his very eyes, and only remnants of it still exists today, but not in the same profound sense that it once did. But then you got W.E. Du Bois, who seemingly abandons his perceived position of the importance of being in America and focusing on the intellectual component of development and overemphasizing the black bourgeoisie, talented TIF perspective, and then finding himself in West Africa, Ghana, when Asajifo Kwame Nkrumah becomes the president and they gain their independence from Britain. And he dies in West Africa. He writes the African Encyclopedia.
Some web results. I'll send them to your iPhone.
Oh, wow. Look at Siri. They listen to everything. So I bring that up to say, how many times are we going to be on these roads that seemingly are parallel to each other, wanting the same thing, but because of the fractured state that we're in, the compromise of our integrity, the compromise of our consciousness, our seeming desire to fit into a society that we would never fit into, right? Yeah, I know we built America. I know we built America. I know we are the very fabric which holds this wicked, ruthless, corrupt country together, right? Listen, America is the worst, most wicked, most corrupt country on the planet today, but I wouldn't have been born anywhere else. Why do I say that? Not because I want to be an American, because what this experience has afforded us who are in America, we know the nature of the enemy up close in front. We know the reality to a degree of our planet, and I believe humbly that it positions us, unlike any other people, to be at the forefront of the global revolution that will truly see a just free world, in particular for the black man and woman, not just over here in the West, but throughout the planet. It's not a coincidence that the West produced, a black American produced Pan-Africanism, right? Like, we have created these concepts because of what we were subjected to. You don't go through that type of traumatic experience for 400 plus years idly to just be a people in cultural and physical and spiritual and social limbo. You do that, you go through that fire, through that test, right? You go through that crucible so that you can be made new to be a better version, to enact justice at another level. So it is a privilege to be born in this condition, because if you are awakened and properly oriented, you are best qualified to produce justice unlike any other people on the planet. My point, America is not for you and I, not the concept. Something new has to be born. Something new has to be born. But I'm going to be honest with you, brothers and sisters. Africa, the way it is not yours either. Those 54 nations weren't the product of the black mind solely. Too much European influence. And I'm not saying that it won't be certain things that we get from our enemy, because a lot of it was from us and it's cyclical. But what I'm saying is that in our attempt to separate, there has to be a cultural revolution. And I'm not just talking about food that you eat, though that is important. I'm not just talking about the clothes that you wear, though that is important. I'm not talking about the language that you speak, though that is important. I'm talking about a idea and the concept rooted in truth that we all as individuals buy into the collective that gains our freedom and sustains our freedom. A culture has an economic, political, social, and physical and mental aspect to it that if we do not integrate completely into, we're going to be in this position perpetually. I want to read something from the book that I made mention to, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, Historical Analysis of the Failure of Black Leadership. Page 157. It says here, I'm reading from E. Franklin Frazier. So it was a quote so he had a paper that he used to write called the La Bourgeoisie Noire. It was between 1928 and 1930, right? And this was a quote from the La Bourgeoisie Noire by E. Franklin Frazier in the book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. Here, we are brought to face with a fundamental dilemma of the Negro life. Dean Kelly Miller at Howard University, once expressed this dilemma, namely that the Negro pays for what he wants and begs for what he needs. The Negro pays on the whole for his church, his lodge, and fraternities, and his automobile, but begs for his education. Even the radical movement a few years back was subsidized by the white radical groups. It did not spring out of any general movement among Negroes towards a radical doctrine. Moreover, black radical theology about the small number of Negroes who had entered in industry from the security of the New York City, but none ever overtook to enter the South and teach the landless peasants any type of self-help. I'm going to start over and read that last part again. He said, the Negro pays on whole, because the Negro pays for what he wants and begs for what he needs. The Negro pays on whole for his church, his lodge, and his fraternities and his automobile, but begs for his education. Even the radical movement a few years ago was backed and subsidized by the white radical group. It did not spring out of any general movement among Negro with radical doctrines. Why is that important? One, we have been oriented to escape our condition by buying into and investing into coping mechanisms. I hate to say it, brothers and sisters, a lot of our religions are coping mechanisms. They don't solve our political, economic, and socio-psychological issues. They allow us to feel good on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then have to go back into the reality that we have to face each and every day. We're Muslim, Hebrew, Christian in name, but we're slave in practice. Let me say that again. I know. But we're having an intellectual, intelligent, honest, and truthful conversation. See, the so-called Negro is the only ones who tries to conflate religion and politics, but understands that for those who understand politics, and I mean like the Europeans, their religion is political. That's why the Catholic Church has land, the Vatican. They have their own government. They have their own economy. They have their own army. Mecca, ran by the Saudis, have their own army. Go to Mecca. Whoever's been in there, you know. Their security forces, they have their own land, Saudi Arabia. They have their own government. They have their own economic system. The Jews, they have their own land. They have their own army, the IDF. They have their own economy. They have their own currency. Our religion is not connected to our political development, meaning our interaction with one another, how we move power. It's a substitute to pacify us in the moment. So we use religion to not deal with the absence of politics. But I don't mean politics in the sense that you vote or lose that. Politics is how you move power. How do you move power? How do you practice politics? You have to have a culture that is centered around the acquisition and the preservation of power. The ability, what's power? The ability to control and define your own reality without outside influence and the ability to stop outside interruption. That's power. That's power. This man behind me in a chapter in his acclaimed writing, God, the Black Man of Truth, had a chapter outlined the power to define. It's your greatest weapon against falsehood, against your enemy. But when you don't have the power to define, it's the most crippling force in your life because somebody else is defining everything that you do and everything that you are. The power to define. So, when you don't understand how those things interject and cross, you fall victim. So, our culture, or the lack thereof, the subculture through the acculturation process, has us buying what we want, but begging for what we need. Because the slave making process, and I go back to the beginning of the conversation, I hope you keeping up with me because I'm interjecting a lot, but I promise you, as you can see, it's all tying together. It's all coming together. I don't lose my thought. I don't have no notes or nothing, but I don't lose my thought. This is all I think about. This is all I think about. That's why it's hard for me to have any normal social interaction because, hell, that's all I can think about. That's all I talk about. So, the reality of our enslavement produced a dichotomy that the slave master gave us perceived, even though it was the most decrepit and depleted and demoralizing state: food, clothing, and shelter. He gave us a shack, bare with a minimum roof, if that, with some hay to lay in. He gave us the worst possible food. And he gave us the most uncomfortable and non-functional clothing, if you would call it that. But he provided those things. He provided those things. And that created a disruptive dissonance in us that is still, to a large degree, for most of us, not all of us not victimized by this, but most of us to a degree are still victimized by the need to go to our enemy for our necessities. Let's go deeper. When we would do for self, Tulsa, Rosewood, when we developed our communities, their dismantling and destruction of them, putting freeways and expressways in the middle of bustling, prosperous communities, criminalizing every activity of the Black man and woman, penalizing us where the man was taken, flooding our communities with crack cocaine and other drugs, and then giving us the disparities of 101 from powdered cocaine to crack cocaine, which created the largest disparity in incarceration, where all of the Black men, young and old, were now imprisoned or strung out on drugs, leaving our women vulnerable in a state where now that the welfare state would swoop in and give them some sense of sustenance, it created a dependency state that had started in our enslavement. So the Negro pays for what he wants because it allows him to escape his reality. I'm not a nigga no more. I can drive a Mercedes. I ain't a nigga no more. I live in an affluent community in a 6, 7, 8 bedroom home. I'm not a nigga no more. I wear Purple Label and chains and this and that. I'm not a nigga no more. I got $1,000 gym shoes. Pacifiers. But we saying we ain't got no education. We don't got our own schools. We don't got our own hospitals. Where's our restaurants? Where's our... But we're begging for that. The orientation of a Negro has caused such the disruption that has displaced us from a reality of doing for self. Man, approaching upon an hour. Please, I'm gonna wrap up this portion because I want to get somewhat to the crux of the topic. But if you got any questions, anybody, please, comments, please put them in now so I can post them and respond to them. Please. If you have any questions, any comments, put them up so we can discuss as we wrap up. I started, what is the current condition of the black man and woman? And is it a time for a new leadership? I earlier stated that absolutely is. The current condition is that we're in such a fractionalized, dejected state that any semblance of what we should be doing is so far removed from what we're actually doing that it's almost, in our sense of trying to wrap our minds around being productive, asinine and inappropriate to stop doing what we're doing, to actually take on a practice and a behavioral attitude that is beneficial for our future. Each generation is moving further and further from the reality of what we want to be as a people. But we are producing those generations. Obviously, we got some help from outside influences. But because we have not created the proper environment with the proper frame and cultural conditioning to separate the two, the lie from the truth, we are in a degenerate state that seems to be moving faster and faster. So we think we don't need leadership. Why? Because we have bought the myth, the fallacy, the lie that homes don't need fathers. That the natural family, man, woman, child, is actually counterproductive and antiquated. The nuclear family is an antiquated idea and concept, and it's immaterial to the progress of her people. We have taken on that disposition. The scripture says you bound the strong man, you robbed the house. We think that the understanding of the importance of a man is delegitimizing the value of a woman. What the hell? That doesn't even make any sense. But we have taken on these perspectives and these perceptions. And so what does it do? It places us in a position that we have no head. And when you have no head, the body aimlessly moves around, bumping into walls and tripping over itself, ultimately leading to its death. So I say to us, we absolutely need leadership. But what type of leadership? What type of structure? Because we've had great men. I got some behind me. Father was a strong man. You're talking about a great man. It's gonna sound like I'm practicing nepotism, but the reality is the reality. Brother even said it, Brother Jeff. He's an icon. I can't omit that reality to pacify people who don't want me to speak about somebody who's near to dear to me in this proper light. But I also got Brother Munir, the Honorable, His Excellency, Ben Ami, Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. We've had the proper guidance and we've had the proper leadership. But our generation, see, just because my father was a great and strong father does not mean that now I don't have to be a father to my children. So what am I saying? We honor our leaders. We honor those who preceded us by being the leaders that we have to be and taking it to the next level. So we damn right need leadership, but we need a certain type of leadership who lead on the front. That's why I love brothers like Tyrone Muhammad, because he puts his life on the line and he leads out front, not from behind. He's in the streets. He's putting his life on the line. He's sacrificing each and every day. We need that type of collective leadership that is a group of us. The total aggregate of us that comes together and forms a nucleus that makes us indestructible, because one of the benefits of the enemy in destroying every movement is that they were individualized. There was a strong leader here, there was a strong leader there, you kill that, you take the head, and now they're disrupted. But if you got a group of us who form a council, who form our own union, who form our own anti-defamation league, who form our own committee of 300, who form our own committee of black men who say enough is enough. Muslim, Hebrew, Christian, whatever, we come together and look at the benefit of our people and form a society that's actually just and equitable, and don't condition ourselves to see the differences, but understand the similarities in our condition forced upon us by our enemy, and we do everything in our power to remove and eradicate that. That, brothers and sisters, the leadership that I'm speaking of. A congregation of strong black men who take to the forefront a new way, a new path, an exodus, not from a physical land, but from a mind that has left us in a degraded state. I thank you for listening. I see there's no questions. Oh, my brother. Shalom, shalom. Thank you, sir. I'm going to leave on that note. Thank you so much for listening. You could have been any other place. Again, we're going to do part 2 to the history that we outlined with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what actually led up to it and the truth behind it and the reality behind the bad faith actors that are at play from all sides. We just given the history. We want to be historically accurate, because to be politically astute is to be historically accurate. Right? And so, again, I started off, and I'm in it the same way. History is best qualified to reward its research. What you're seeing what happened with Diddy, what you're seeing what happened with the mayor of New York and other, it's a witch hunt, as it should be. Because a lot of us think that we would find refuge in their system. And it's on and on and on. So many examples. History is replete of it. But that's why we, who are properly oriented, are going to create a new paradigm. See, because when we take our rightful throne, you don't have a situation like Diddy or anybody else that exists, because we put an end to that at the very outset. There's not an environment where a person like that could have. And I'm not condoning, because we understand what the European is doing. But I'm saying it's what our young men, when we take home, there ain't no reality where the young men can run rampant in the communities. There is no reality where the enemy can destroy us from within, and we destroy ourselves from within. Not only can we do it, we are doing it, and we're going to see that day, and that day is now. I thank you for listening. I leave you in the words of peace. Shalom alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.
my way to Bootsy Bello.